assignment in a class I took, and I put it down for years and then picked it up when I was doing my master's, and it's kind of been one of those things that has stayed with me and continues to be of great interest to me. So one of the things I want to say, because this is the first time I've spoken about this in Millbrook. So I know all of you, or many of you at least, have your own stories to tell. And really this project for me, my larger project, is going to be and is already made up of oral histories and stories from people who remember the Commune or are part of the Commune. I've interviewed both so far. So I would very much love to hear from you if you have a story to tell. Maybe not tonight, but I'm going to give my contact information out. I'm going to leave a pile of business cards. I'd love to continue to do my research in this, the Historical Society and other places in the area. So I just wanted to say that before I jump in. Really, I look at this project overall, and I look at the Commune as kind of following a tradition of non-traditional thought in New York State. It includes the Burnt Over District, it includes the Oneida community, it includes the Shakers, and on and on and on. Really, to me, what happened at Millbrook and what happened in the Commune is part of that. The story begins at Harvard University in really 1959 when Timothy Leary was hired as a lecturer in psychology. One of the great mistakes of people who talk about this topic is saying that he was a professor. He was not technically a professor, he was a lecturer. But anyway, he was hired to come to Harvard and work in the behavioral sciences department, essentially. He was a traditional psychologist. He was a PhD from Berkeley. But the summer after he was hired, he was on vacation in Mexico and experimented with psychedelic mushrooms. And this really changed the course of his career. He went from being a traditional academic psychologist into an experimenter with psychedelics. He did this initially at Harvard in a very academic way. He was running academic experiments. He was running tests with different subjects, along with his colleague, Richard Alpert, the gentleman on the right. They initiated a project called the Harvard Psilocybin Project. Perhaps unfortunately for them, they ran afoul of the administration at Harvard, which is a whole separate story. But let's just say that the scientific method that they were not adhering to caused them some significant problems, as did experimenting with psychedelic substances outside of the laboratory. So initially, the Harvard Psilocybin Project, because of their problems at Harvard, transitioned into a not-for-profit organization called the International Foundation for Internal Freedom, IF is the acronym. And this was made up not only of Leary and Alpert and members of the Psilocybin Project, like Ralph Metzner and some other PhD students at the time, but other prominent academics in the area and in the field, including Houston Smith, Alan Watts, and Walter Houston Clark. Houston Smith at the time was at MIT nearby. He took part, all of these scholars took part in the experiments that were going on at Harvard. Probably the most dramatic and most influential person during this time period at Harvard for Leary and his group was Aldous Huxley, who, as chance would have it, was a visiting scholar at MIT during this time period. Leary and the group had read The Doors of Perception and Heaven and Hell, the legendary long essays that Huxley published in the 50s. They were hugely influential on the burgeoning experimentation with psychedelics that was going on, and the fact that he was literally down the road from where Leary and his group were was very important. He met with Leary several times during the Harvard era to discuss ideas related to what he thought the best way forward with psychedelics would be. There's two key characters that play a role during this period, Huxley being one of them. The other one was Allen Ginsberg, the famous beat poet. He took part in the psilocybin project as a subject. He traveled to Harvard in 1961 and became friends with Leary after that. And really, Leary and Huxley kind of helped, Huxley and Ginsberg helped Leary formulate this idea of bringing psychedelics out of the laboratory and into the society at large. He had a firm belief, and those around him also believed, that the beneficial aspects of psychedelics outweighed the potential negative aspects. And this was in line with the thoughts at the time. These substances were not illegal at this time. Experimentation was going on internationally, and there was really a belief that they had potential for beneficial psychological benefits. And there was, of course, most experimenters were not talking about going around and giving them to the general population. They were talking about using them in psychotherapy, using them as very, with very strict guidelines. Ginsberg, his view was that everyone should have access to psychedelics. He was very much of the mind that there should be no restrictions. Huxley, on the other hand, thought the only way that the psychedelics are going to play a beneficial role in society at large is for the elite to gain acceptance of them. So he said to Leary, you should be turning on, quote unquote, the best and brightest of our society. So that's artists, writers, intellectuals. So while Leary and his group was at Harvard, through the connections that Ginsberg was able to give him, and Huxley as well, Leary started traveling to New York City, to other places on the East Coast, introducing psychedelics to a wider audience. Again, these substances were not illegal, but it was very, very non-traditional to be handing out psychedelics at a cocktail party or something like that. So he was very much going against the grain. Partially because of this, and partially because of his conflict with the administration at Harvard, and really for the fact that he just stopped going to the classes he was supposed to teach. He was actually, his contract was not renewed in 1963, the spring of 1963. Richard Alpert was actually fired for giving psychedelics to an undergraduate student, which was completely off the reservation as far as the group, as far as Harvard was concerned. So the original idea for this commune was to exist in Mexico. That was their first choice. So they moved, the members of the IFIF, as it was known, moved to Mexico and rented out a beach hotel in Zihuatanejo, Mexico, which is 125 miles northwest of Acapulco, I believe. The group moved there, but that didn't last long. Part of the problem was the Mexican government was not keen on having this group, which had gained some notoriety. It's very important to note that when Leary and Alpert left Harvard, there were articles appearing in newspapers, there were articles appearing in magazines, in widely publicated magazines. It was quite the sensation for Harvard to fire a professor and or not renew a professor over the psychedelics. So the Mexican government, essentially they lasted about 6 weeks before the Mexican government asked them to leave. So they tried landing in the Caribbean. They tried the Caribbean islands. That didn't last. That lasted even less long. And they were kind of going back to Massachusetts saying, we don't know if we have a future. We don't know where we're going to be. And luckily for them, one of the people that they had been involved with through Allen Ginsberg and through Aldous Huxley and through the socialization that they were doing in New York City, that Leary specifically was doing in New York City, was Peggy Hitchcock. And Peggy Hitchcock mentioned that her brothers had purchased some property in Millbrook, and that perhaps they would be willing to rent out the unused large building to Leary and his group. So Richard Elpert, a pilot of a Cessna airplane, according to the story he told me, he flew with Peggy down to meet the brothers, and they were able to rent the mansion house for a nominal fee. And so they had a location from which to fully begin and fully flesh out this idea of communal living, this continuing idea of utilizing psychedelics, experimenting with them, trying to determine the benefits, the possibilities, which they would do for the first few years. One of the things about my project that I'm specifically interested in is the effect that this is why you are also important, is the effect of all of this on the village itself. To me, it seems fascinating that this group would suddenly appear in a small upstate village, similar to the one I grew up in Steuben County. So I've always thought, what was that like for the people who were living there? And according to some of the press that I've read of the time, initially the reaction was somewhat nonplussed, I guess, or at least not, there was no confrontation, according to these early articles. In fact, they were accepted in the village, even though they had notoriety, even though articles had been written about the Harvard ordeal and even the Mexican problems that they had. And there's a couple of reasons for this. The initial reason is, I believe, the group was very small at this time. This article states that there were, I think, 6 adults and 7 children, or 7 adults and 6 children. We're not talking large numbers here. They were confined for the most part. I mean, obviously they were interacting in the village, but they were not flamboyant at this time period as well. So there's a general understanding that although they're eccentric in some level, they were also all highly educated. They were almost all PhDs and/or MDs who were part of this initial group. So I find that very interesting, and you see it played out in the press. During this era, so they moved in November of 1963. So 1963, Aldous Huxley died the same day that JFK was assassinated. In December of 1963. Oh wait, yes, November 1963. So right after they moved in. So this first era, they continued to have interactions with New York City. They continued to have interactions, mostly through Allen Ginsberg, with jazz musicians, with other writers. So they started attracting some residents and/or long-term visitors who spent time there, including Maynard Ferguson, the jazz trumpeter, Charles Mingus, although he didn't live there all the time, he was often a guest, the jazz bassist, and the author and poetess Diane DePrima lived there for a period of time as well. They also attracted visitors during this first few years. The most famous of which is Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters, who came in 1964 as part of their cross-country journey aboard the Further bus. It's immortalized in Tom Wolfe's Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. There's an entire chapter on it. The meeting did not necessarily go well. The two groups were incredibly different, especially at this early time. Leary's group was more introspective. They were heavily into Eastern philosophy, Eastern religion at this point, through the work of Alan Watts and also Huxley. So they were very much a kind of a reserved group when compared to the Merry Pranksters, who showed up literally setting off fire bombs and explosions and loud music, and they were all about performance art. And so the two groups didn't necessarily hit it off and weren't simpatico, so to speak. One of the things that I came to realize in doing the research for this was that money was an issue for the group. Nobody had a steady job. This wasn't and it was expensive, even though the group wasn't huge at this point. It was still expensive to feed and take care of people. So In 1964, 1965, they started thinking about ways to bring in income and also to get the word about what they were doing. So they started a lecture series, essentially, really performance art, at the various theaters throughout New York City. And these were written up in the New York Times, these were written up in other places. They attracted large crowds, and they really were very early examples of kind of psychedelic shows, because what they were trying to do is show an audience what it was like to be on psychedelics without being on psychedelics. So they used different not lasers, but lights and incense and different things like that. The other thing they did was open their house to visiting guests on the weekend. So you could pay a fee to come and spend the weekend. And again, they were trying to show the effects of psychedelics. So they would do things like change the color of food. So they would make milk blue, or change the color of things to kind of distort perception. They also did things like yoga, which was extremely not common at that time. So they introduced yoga to their visitors. They had macrobiotic diet. This is like 1964, 65, so this is pretty early. But again, it was a way for them to increase their treasury so that they could pay for the commune to exist. But what these two things did collectively was increase not only the amount of visitors to Millbrook and to the commune itself, but notoriety. So you're getting written up in the newspaper, getting written up in the New York Times, and interestingly, you almost never, of course, it makes sense, you would never see Leary mentioned or his group mentioned without Millbrook being mentioned too. So Millbrook became known as it was written, the East Coast Mecca of psychedelics. So not necessarily the type of notoriety that people would want. This is a famous photograph of Leary, one of his performances at the Village Theater, which became the Fillmore East, by the way, in New York City. So they would do these different religious themed, they did the illumination of Buddha, they did the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, and so on. Things changed abruptly for the group, and really the first phase of their existence kind of, if you could look at it, was really a turning point in the end of 1965 when Leary and his future wife and daughter and another commune member were arrested in Laredo, Texas, they were trying to go to Mexico for Christmas break, and they were denied entry into Mexico. It's a very odd story, but they were denied entry into Mexico and asked to return to the United States. And when they were coming back to the United States, even though they had not actually gone into Mexico, they were stopped and searched. And they found a small amount of marijuana on Susan Leary, his daughter, and they were jailed. And it was a front page news across the country, and really had two effects. Number one, again, more publicity, negative publicity for the group, for Millbrook as an extension, but also it really focused Leary on becoming more and more outspoken. Leary's reaction to this was not to become quiet and kind of step back and think about what he was doing and worry about this court case. He was actually sentenced to 30 years in prison and a $30,000 fine for less than an ounce of marijuana. I mean, it was a serious offense at that time. But instead of shrinking back and maybe coming back to the mansion house and going from there, he flew into action, and his action was to go on the attack against the establishment, and that he did so by his sentencing did have an alternative effect where people were like, well, that's an amazingly harsh sentence for what the actual crime was. So he did have allies on his side as well in the press and other places. This is him and his daughter awaiting sentencing in 1965. So as this is happening, and as Leary is awaiting his sentencing, and as his name is flashed throughout the press, there started to be more and more articles about LSD in general, most of them negative. If you look at the statistics pre-1966, LSD is rising in the number of times it's mentioned in the press and the number of times that it's talked about on TV shows or in magazines. In 1966, it explodes. And there's actually a great book that came out 2 years ago by Stephen Schrift called Acid Hype that really dives into, he's a media scholar, and he dives into what happened and why that happened. And Leary's one of the reasons for that. But you have this negative publicity bordering on hysteria happening in the press regarding LSD specifically, but psychedelics. Some of it verified because there were things going on. As the drug became more prevalent, there were more incidences of bad things happening and things happening in general. So you have Leary getting arrested, you have an explosion of negative publicity in the press, and you have Leary kind of going on the offensive, going wherever he can, any microphone in front of his face, he's talking about the benefits of LSD, he's talking about what the group is doing, so on and so forth. So this reaches the attention of the Senate. They plan a hearing, 1966, supposed to be chaired by Robert Kennedy. For some reason, the day that Timothy Leary testified, he was an expert witness, they asked him to testify. For whatever reason, Robert Kennedy wasn't there, but his brother was. And this led to an exchange between Kennedy and Leary that's very combative, to say the least. There's Leary. So again, more publicity for Leary. He's in the newspaper. He's talking about LSD. LSD is also in the newspaper in completely negative terms. It's getting more and more negative. There's less talk of scientists seeing beneficial properties or potential benefits. It becomes more and more negative as negative things continue to happen. So as a result, obviously, there was pressure within the community to start maybe looking at what was going on and what Leary was up to. And the two leaders of this were G. Gordon Liddy, who was Assistant District Attorney, Dutchess County, as you know, and Sheriff Larry Quinlan. So the two of them, they go on the offensive, and they raid the estate and in 1966, and they, thinking that they're going to find all manner of nefarious drugs and craziness going on, instead they found some peat moss and a science experiment kit from Jack Leary, but they eventually do find marijuana and other things, and so it becomes a real issue among the community, and rightfully so. Again, you have Leary out in the papers whenever he can, talking about being combative and talking about his group. And at one point, he, partially because of his defense for his marijuana conviction, he was trying to say that he used it as part of his religion. So, as a practicing Hindu, he was allowed to use marijuana, which didn't float. But because of this, he decided he was going to incorporate his group as a religion in New York State, as an actual religious organization called the League of Spiritual Discovery, LSD. So they did, and Leary at this point is transitioned. This is the fall of 1966. Again, he's in the press. He's combating this pressure from the authorities and the legal system by being more outrageous and being more kind of combative is the term, but more unorthodox too. Like you said, if the Hindu religion is not something I can utilize to protect me, I'm going to form my own religion. And this is how the Neo-American Church becomes involved with Leary's group. So actually you had another separate group coming and moving into essentially the commune. Again, local reaction, anti-LSD group. Again, combative, back and forth between some of the residents of the town and some of the law enforcement officials and Leary. You see the Millbrook round table. I did do an oral history with somebody who said that they were in high school when this happened, and they remember their parents going to this meeting and coming home and telling them, you know, stay away from that estate. Don't ever go on that estate. There's all sorts of craziness there. And this person told me that the first thing they wanted to do then was go jump the fence and hang out in the estate because there was all this fun stuff happening. So it didn't necessarily have the effect it did. But you have to think of, too, this time the commune changed partially as a result of the publicity it was getting, the weekends being open. It grew in size. So there were, at any given time during this period, 1966, 1967, there could be 50, 60 people at the estate. And it really, that had an effect too. You started seeing people who were maybe non-traditional looking or younger people kind of wandering around and things like that. And that had an effect as well. Part of the other problem was the kind of steadying hand of Leary, of the partnership between Leary and Alpert was Alpert himself. And he had a falling out with Leary in 1965 and moved off from the estate. Of course, he eventually goes to India, becomes Baba Ram Das, who is one of the more influential kind of Western gurus. I was able to interview him, so he was able to give me a lot of insight, but he says that part of the problem was that there was no kind of steadying hand for Leary as things kind of spiraled out of control. This is a good editorial cartoon. Why wouldn't Millbrook be happy for being the psychedelic center of the world? And this is true though. Like, I did an analysis of the articles in the major press, the AP articles and New York Times and large newspapers, and it's almost always mentioned Millbrook. So it's not, it couldn't be escaped. When you talked about Leary, you talked about LSD, and you talked about Millbrook. Those are the three things. You got to remember, this is before, this is the summer of love, but most of what was going on was before anything in San Francisco really took off. It was, especially in 1963, I mean, they were on, the beginnings of any of the kind of countercultural movement that was happening. More articles about some of the, again, this is the New York Times. You can see the first New York Times article was saying how accepted the group was and how calm the residents were and how nonplussed they were about any scandals or anything like that. And I see John Keating. I knew you were in that. There he is. So by this time, there's some unease. There's some people who are saying that it's hysteria and that the group isn't that bad and we shouldn't overreact. There's others saying we should really look into this. They're doing nefarious things, and we should look into maybe figuring out a way to get them to leave. Example of kind of the split within the community, I would say, is some of Glenn Van Brommer's art editorials and cartoons. This is a result of the roadblocks. Anybody remember the roadblocks? Some people do. Yeah, so they set up roadblocks and caused quite a mess, I guess, related to people going in and out of town and blocking access. And what they were doing was searching people, looking for drugs, and rightfully so. Again, Leary, LSD, Millbrook, again, over and over again. So it makes sense, but it caused a problem with the community because they were being pulled over too. Just normal residents were being pulled over, asked to get out of their car, the cars were searched. So it really caused some backlash for the sheriff in the press. But the pressure on the organization itself, the group itself, which was fluctuating in size and people were coming and going, the fact that the place was being raided kind of regularly, the fact that they did find illegal substances there, they found marijuana on people, the fact that charges were being brought possibly against one of the Hitchcock brothers as a result of being the owner of the facility where drugs were found, led to the group essentially being forced to leave. The landlords said, okay, this is enough, everybody out. So they moved, and they fell apart, essentially. They didn't really move because they just kind of split up. Some people followed Leary some of the members of the Commune followed Leary to California. He relocates there in 1968, runs for governor in 1969 against Ronald Reagan, doesn't win. But he has a very famous campaign song. Does anybody know what his campaign song was? It was written specifically for him. It was Come Together by Beatles. It was actually written for him. Because his slogan was Come Together, Join the Party. So John Lennon wrote Come Together. I would like to talk a little bit about what I think the legacy was. I think it's an interesting story in many ways. Again, the local reaction and the community's role in this, I think, is fascinating. I think the organization itself was interesting because it was a precursor to some of the things that ended up happening, not the drug thing, because that wasn't successful, but the multimedia shows that they did, the weekend retreats that they opened up, and the yoga, the things like that, they existed before the Esalen Institute actually opened. They were kind of at the same time, but it was, so the human potential movement that came out of the Esalen Institute, humanistic psychology, of which Leary was part of, and some of the other, obviously the counterculture and things like that, were all really kind of started here, I would argue, not in San Francisco. So that to me is fascinating. Some of the negative aspects, of course, are the casualties of the drugs. There's serious consequences to that. One of the other consequences was essentially Leary, we can't take all the blame, but he can take a lot of the blame because of the negative publicity given to his actions and psychedelics in general. Research on psychedelics was ended for over 40 years. It becomes a Schedule I narcotic, it becomes completely controlled, but more than that, actual medical research is just stopped for the most part. It's starting to happen again. Johns Hopkins University study that came out in 2008 was one of the first ones that was actually confirmed some of the research that Leary did at Harvard. So you're starting to see it now. In Europe, you're seeing a lot of research going on. Psychedelics are being used in psychotherapy as they were then. They're also being used for PTSD, for migraines, for a variety of things. So you're starting to see that come back, but I've talked to people who are part of research groups in other universities or other organizations who are legitimate scientists who said they fully blame Timothy Leary for the research ending. And whether that's right or wrong, and he certainly had a part in it, but it was, to them an unfortunate thing because they do see under the right circumstances and the laboratory environment, using psychoanalysis and a variety of tools that there could be a benefit. And they just felt the research shouldn't have been ended because of one person being in the newspaper all the time. So, I don't know where I am on time. Bill says good. I could talk about this forever, but I've limited myself. I wanted you to have my contact information, and I have business cards. Should anyone want to talk further in the future, I would love to interview people as part of my oral history project, if you're willing. But for right now, I'll just open it up to questions. Am I good with that, Bill? Who wants to go? Yes, sir.
What has happened to the property? Is the home still there?
Still there, yeah. As far as I know, it's.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, he's asking what happened to the property. It's still there. It's a big estate.
Is it being used for anything now?
I'm not sure if the big. Does anyone know if the big house is being used?
They're renovating it.
It is.
John Foreman lived there.
I remember. I spoke to John. I did interview John Foreman years ago before he passed. Unfortunately, and he was living there. But there is. So it's still there, the property is still there, the house is still there. Yes?
Yeah, one aspect that I think you didn't talk about so much was Robert Thurman, who was then a monk,
Yes.
known as Tenzin,
Yep.
who is the father of
Uma.
the famous Uma Thurman,
Yeah.
who was married to Nana. And Nana's brother did the psychedelic lights.
Okay.
You may not know that.
I do know that. I knew
Yeah.
that, and I know that.
And I knew him quite well.
Okay, good.
And so there was a whole group of artists who
Yes.
also used black lights and did mandalas with Jose Arguelles.
Okay.
And a lot, so that
We should
became a
talk.
book called Mandala, and there's that.
I knew they called it
aspect.
trans
And
art.
the Tibetan Buddhist aspect
Mhm.
is extremely important
Mhm.
for this community because they were actively studying Tibetan Buddhism.
Yeah, absolutely. And Robert Thurman, of course, met Nana through Timothy Leary because he was married to her.
Yes, Nana was married, Nana Schlebrugger was married to Timothy Leary and then
Yes.
got married to Robert.
Yep. I did know that. And there's a film of that wedding that took place in the Episcopal Church in town here. Timothy Leary's wedding to Nana, which is really interesting because Charles Mingus was playing piano at his wedding. So.
Wow.
But thank you. I'd like to dive more into that. I only know of it in, I know what they were doing, but I don't know the specifics.
And also the psychiatrist, Mr. Sirohi, who was for the Westlake Developmental Center psychiatrist, became a, what do you call it, a subject, and had been a PhD at Cornell, and as a young Indian gentleman of age 27 was completely surprised at being a subject. So he would be someone for you to interview.
Absolutely. Fantastic.
He's deceased.
Oh,
He is deceased. Oh, I didn't know that. That's sad.
any other, I saw some other hands over here, maybe. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I grew up here, and well, we were crew cut kids, and all the rednecks used to beat jazz up in high school all the time. Remember that? And we used to make a joke that Timothy Leary was on the water tower, pulling LSD in a water tower. Don't drink the water.
But he really wasn't.
And we used to go to Hitchcock's all the time. A friend of mine, Louis and Charlie Rowan, they're dead. They're both dead right now. But we used to have cars up there. We used to race around, and Albert used to try to catch us. We're getting behind us, start beating the horn. They were both like, we drove everybody nuts. Susan, Tommy, and Aurora, and Billy, they said, no problem. We people that lived there and everything else, and it was a farm.
Great.
It was cool. It was really good. But we didn't know what was going on. We were so damn young. Though you were old days, girls just taking their clothes off, going swimming. I thought that was the greatest thing in the world. I was like, wow.
Anyone else? Yes.
Is Wings Castle open for tours?
Yeah.
I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Is Wings Castle open for tours?
Yes.
King's Castle?
Yes.
Okay.
I thought it was related in some way. Is it related in any way?
Not that I know of, but
The other thing I wanted to say, I have a friend, Lucy Young in Rosendale, who knew Timothy Leary.
Okay.
I just got off the phone with her before I came,
Great.
and she said she had known the Merry Pranksters, and she was a teenager in San Francisco
Okay.
around that time.
I'll give you my card.
So she might be interested in telling you her story, I guess.
Great. Thank you. Yes?
How did she able to escape going to prison? Because you didn't say anything more about it.
Yeah, I didn't get into his post-Millbrook life. He does go to prison, actually. Yeah, he gets arrested in California in 1969-ish, and goes to jail because he violated his probation from the Laredo arrest. He gets caught with marijuana. He goes to jail. He gets sentenced to a medium to minimum security prison in California. Long sentence, I forget the exact amount, but anyway, long story short is he gets broken out of prison by the Weather Underground in 1970. And then he has a really interesting life beyond Millbrook. I focus on Millbrook, but anybody that wants to read the Robert Greenfield biography of Leary, it's a great book. But yeah, he gets broken out of prison. He flees to Switzerland. He first to Algeria and lives with the Black Panthers for a while, then gets kicked out of there and goes to Switzerland, and eventually gets rearrested in Afghanistan and is sent to federal jail. And there's a controversy that erupts because supposedly in the 1970s, he names names to get his sentence reduced. And he has always maintained, or he maintained up until he died, that no information that he gave was ever used to convict anybody, but it really caused problems for him among his former friends. Not necessarily Millbrook at this point. This is California. These are some people in the 70s that end up going to jail for manufacturing LSD, and supposedly he gave names. But I don't know much about that. But the Robert Greenfield book is a great biography. Did you have a question? No. Okay.
You said that they had a chance to kind of distill what works around living together. I was wondering if there was any like internal documentation of
Yeah.
what they did learn. Anything about the Moody Blues and Timothy Leary said no, he's outside the pool.
I know as far as living together, they actually, I probably should have got more into it, but they actually started the kind of communal living in Massachusetts. They lived together, Elpert and Leary, they rented a house. So they were writing about what they were doing. And the Timothy Leary archive at the New York Public Library has, one thing about Leary, he may have been crazy, but he kept really good notes. It's a huge archive. And there's letters back and forth even as early as 1961, 62, where they're talking about trying to understand ways that people can live together communally. And instead of, individual pursuits, do things in a group way. And this was a result, I think, of their experimentation with psychedelics. They were starting to, and Leary writes about calling it the group mind, where when they would take psychedelics together, they could actually read each other's thoughts and things like that. So that to them led to, everything needs to be communal, we need to think, together and work together. By the time they're here, they're experimenting in a lot of different arrangements, open marriage arrangements, non-possession, no possession arrangements, and to varying levels of success. They really had challenges as far as relationships and things like that, and that's part of the reason that Richard Elpert left. Overall, I don't know that they succeeded in that. I think they were, part of the argument could be, well, they were crazy and they were, doing all these things. The other argument is they had immense pressure on them. They're being raided and things are happening like that. So, but I don't know as far as, was it did they have to find a successful model? Probably not. And Timothy Leary's dead. Yeah, I don't know. I know the song. I don't know how that came about. It came out in 1967, but what it does is show that Leary was at this point an international celebrity, and so it wasn't just a local thing. I mean, he was people were writing songs about it. Any other questions? Yes.
Where did he end up spending the last few years of his life?
So after he gets out of federal jail in the mid to late 70s, he actually goes on a speaking tour in the early 80s with G. Gordon Liddy. Because he's essentially broke because he's been in jail and all his money has gone to legal defense. And so he does that for a while, and he becomes really involved in the computer industry, like the development of software, early virtual reality. This is like the 80s, like the concepts of all that. He's constantly writing books. That's kind of how he pays his bills. But he spent the last, say since the late 70s up until his death in 1996 in California. He went to Berkeley, was where he got his. Yeah, Berkeley. He spent some time there, but then I think he ended up passing away. He basically lived in Hollywood or that area, LA, for probably at least the last 10 years.
What was his, did he get cancer?
Yeah, he had cancer. He died of cancer, yeah. So he was 1996. He died. Yes?
You know Jack's still alive?
Yes. Theory.
You
Yeah.
know where he is?
I don't. Last I heard he was in California, but I don't know specifically. I've never talked to him. I know he had a falling out with the father. But I have talked to people who remember him from here, and Susan as well. Yes, sir.
He's in Oregon.
Oh, is he?
He
Okay.
sent him an email this morning.
Oh, really? Excellent. I'll talk with you after. It's not somebody I've talked to. I wasn't sure.
Was the Grounded Space Colony, was that ever an official name?
No, that's a great chapter name, though. I wanted to use that for my, but I found that the quote, astronauts of inner space, is part of that, so that's not my original one. Okay, continuing the hook. One more?
Suicide, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
Susan did, yeah.
Yeah, Susan, when I used Tim Ferguson's name,
Yeah.
he had some good times, I'll tell you.
I'll give you my card. I talked to Lisa Ferguson.
Having a good time.
All right, one more, let's do one more here.
How are they procuring the psychedelics?
So originally they were getting, Leary bought a lot of it right before he left Harvard on Harvard stationery. It was still legal. You could, as a researcher, you could basically get unlimited amounts. So he, kind of one of his final acts at Harvard was sent off a order form on Harvard stationery. I don't know how much. But then by the time it was illegal, they were getting it from a variety of sources. August Owsley Stanley visited Millbrook. Grateful Dead visited Millbrook. So they were getting it illicitly through various means, but they were still there was a conduit of it coming from places where it was still legal as well, because they were being visited not only by musicians and beat writers and things like that, but they were being visited by psychologists and researchers and academics as well. R.D. Lang came to Millbrook. People like that were visiting them as well. And so I don't know specifically. I can only assume. And then later on, when Leary moves to California, he becomes involved with the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, which is a whole other story.
But there was a lab, right? Wasn't there a lab that produced LSD in California?
Oh, probably Stanley. Yeah, I mean there was Stanley's. Yeah, I was like, they were getting, right up until it became illegal. Before they actually left doing academic research, they were getting it from the Sandoz laboratory. It was the people who invented. So we're getting pure LSD in liquid form. So, okay. in the hook.